Hi, I'm Eric. I'm back with another video. It is now, what is it, Thursday, July 24th, 2025. And what I want to talk about today is what I call firsts. I feel like we're in uncharted territory where things are happening that have never happened before, and that marks a significant shift in how what the direction of events going forward is going to be. So I'm calling this firsts, and I'll just go through some of the firsts that I see happening. First is that this is the first time the two parties are fighting openly over the previously stolen election. Now, going back, what I've wanted to point out in the past is that stolen elections are basically an intramural sport within the U.S. ruling class. Back in 1944, the People's Choice, Henry Wallace, was the vice president under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted to renominate him, and the Democratic National Committee, the people who actually run the Democratic Party, were at odds with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They were pursuing an imperialist agenda, and they call it the American century. That was their vision, and Henry Wallace's vision was the century of the common man. They didn't want any part of that. So at the nominating convention in 1944, they basically prevented his name being placed in nomination. They foisted Harry Truman on the people. Harry Truman was basically shoved into office against FDR's will, but FDR at that point didn't have the physical or intellectual power. He was quite sick at the time, and so the result is that Harry Truman won. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. Harry Truman takes on the presidency, and the atomic bombs drop. Henry Wallace never would have allowed that to happen. Harry Truman went forward with the Cold War. Henry Wallace would never have allowed that to happen. But that was an example of an election that was thrown, and nobody really did anything about it. Then you have the case that was in 1944. And there may be, who knows what else was going on, but in 1960, it said that JFK was, it was questionable whether he won Chicago or not. The mayor of Chicago, who was the head of a kind of a quasi, what can I say? Is it legal or what? But in any case, he was the head of the Democratic Party machine, and JFK won Chicago with some questionable votes, and Nixon decided not to contest the election. But of course, 3 years later, JFK he loses his job, with extreme prejudice, because he had apparently offended the powers that be, wherever they are. So that was another example of election interference. Then in 1968. There was a war going on. Of course, they'd also killed Robert F. Kennedy, so that was another example of election interference by the Democrats. And then on the Republican side, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at the time, he said he wouldn't run for election, and he was trying to negotiate an early end to the Vietnam War. But the future President Nixon, he wasn't president at the time, actually went behind LBJ's back and said to the South Vietnamese, walk out of the peace talks, because under me you'll get a better deal. So that was an example of gross interference in the U.S. election by the Republicans against the Democrat. So that's 1968. Again, in 1980, you had Ronald Reagan in an election with Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter there was this hostage situation where let me see, this is 1980, yeah. So Jimmy Carter was trying to negotiate the release of these hostages, which had been taken hostage by the students of the Islamic Revolution, And so that was a huge problem for Jimmy Carter, and he had the idea that if he could get the hostages released, he'd have a better chance of winning. However, Ronald Reagan's future head of the CIA, Bill Casey, negotiated behind Jimmy Carter's back in order to prevent the release of the hostages until January 20th. And as soon as Reagan is not nominated, as soon as he is sworn in as president, immediately the hostages are released. So this is called the October surprise. So that was another example of election interference. And then you had in the year 2000, again, the Republican George W. Bush. His brother was the governor of Florida, and his brother Jeb Bush, who famously said at one point, "If you want to make any money, you have to lie." Yeah, he actually said that, which is, it's at least he was honest about lying. He said he basically kicked thousands of African Americans off the voter rolls using some very, very dodgy methods, depriving them of the right to vote. And then when the election became really close to call because of hanging chads and other irregularities in the vote count, finally the Supreme Court has to make a decision. Are they going to allow a recount or not? And with an unsigned decision, they voted against allowing a recount to occur. And it turns out subsequently that yes, if the recount had been allowed to occur, then Al Gore would have won the election. But Al Gore didn't contest it. He said, well, for the good of the country, we'll just have to, we know, who cares about the democratic process here? We just want things to be okay. So he put up with it. That was in the year 2000. And then in 2004, John Kerry is running against George Bush again. Both of them belong to the same secretive fraternity called Skull and Bones. And if you asked either one of them, what is this fraternity that you both belong to, they said, it's so secret we can't talk about it. It's kind of nice to have some transparency there. But again, George Bush's campaign manager in the state of Ohio also happened to be the Secretary of State. And there's an old saying attributed to Stalin, the Soviet Union leader. At one point, he said, "It doesn't matter what people vote for. What counts is who counts the vote." So the Secretary of State, who happens to be the same campaign manager for George Bush, declares the election in favor of George Bush rather than John Kerry. And John Kerry had the chance to take the situation to court to dispute this, and John Kerry refused to, go against his fraternity brother. So that was another example of an election that was basically probably stolen, and nobody did anything about it. So that takes us up to the year 2016, 2020, and 2024, and now they're really getting serious. So we find out, and of course, in 2016, anybody like myself, and lots of commentators are talking about this. They say, look, we know Russia was not involved in this election interference. The Democratic Party, the National Committee, conspired against Bernie Sanders to deny him the nomination, and when Hillary Clinton lost the election, they blamed it on Russia. And it was proven that the DNC emails were as a result of a disgruntled DNC employee, probably Seth Rich, taking those emails and sending them to WikiLeaks. But the Democratic Party said, "Oh, Russia hacked the emails, and they were interfering with ads and all these kinds of things," and all of that has been subsequently disproven. What's so interesting about this is the first time that there's been an actual dispute between the parties where one party is accusing the other. And in this case, the Republicans haven't stolen a number of elections when the Democrats started acting just as dirty, um, they say, oh, we can't have this kind of stuff, and it's treason and so on. Well, this is just, it's all theater. These parties, they're both at each other's throats, and at the same time they're allies because they both support empire. So that's the reality of that. Okay, so what's the next thing of first-time events? The next event, which is extremely critical, is the fact that we're witnessing a genocide in Gaza. So backing up again, in World War II, for example, this was where genocide really became a real world issue, of course. And in terms of the Holocaust, it said 6 million Jews died. The question is how many actually died or not. But the reality is that genocide actually occurred at least in 3 ways. The first way was just in the city of Leningrad in the Soviet Union. The Germans had surrounded the city, blockaded it, and the population of roughly about 2 million people, almost the same size as Gaza, where 1 million people starved to death or died of disease. So it's not so different from what has happened to Gaza. Another example during World War II was the case where the British deliberately cut off food supplies to Bengal, which is a district of colonial India. And as a result of having food supplies cut off, 2 to 3 million Indians died. And interestingly enough, Winston Churchill, that great hero of World War II and a great humanitarian, said that he accused the Indians of multiplying like rabbits, and it's just too bad for them if many of them starve to death. That's the attitude that the British had, at least Winston Churchill. So that's an example of genocide. But in both those cases, and in the case of the genocide of millions of Slavic people, not to mention the catastrophe that occurred to China at the hands of the Japanese, while they were happening, those genocides were not reported. But in this case, here we have this genocide. It's going on in front of the entire world, and nobody is doing anything about it. What is so egregious about this is the fact that in the past you have had interventions by the United States. For example, in Yugoslavia, they accused Serbia of committing atrocities, and the United States and NATO unilaterally, without UN authorization, went in, bombed Serbia for 78 days. They destroyed the country, and they basically broke up Yugoslavia, which was essentially the last holdout of socialism in Europe. So that was an example of gross violation of international law. They got away with it. And then we had Libya, we had Syria, we had Afghanistan, of course, where after 9/11, the United States had, before 9/11, the United States government had said to the Afghan government, we want this pipeline to go through Afghanistan, and we want it to be an American pipeline. And if you allow that, we'll give you a carpet of gold. And if you don't allow that, we'll give you a carpet of bombs. And of course, the Afghan government said, we don't want to do that. We want to hire our own people to build that pipeline. And so the United States invaded Afghanistan, destroyed the country, and for 20 years or longer, the country had been decimated. And again, this is completely illegal. Nobody did anything about it. And then you had the case of Iraq, where Iraq was invaded twice on the basis of lies. First, in the basis of the first time was accusations that Saddam had invaded Kuwait and had thrown babies out of incubators, which outraged the American people, and said, "Oh, well, on the basis of human rights, we need to overthrow the government of Saddam." Well, they didn't want to actually overthrow him; they just wanted to weaken him. And then back in 2003, they finally came up with this idea of weapons of mass destruction, And again, circumventing international law, they violated that and they destroyed Iraq. And you had Syria with chemical weapons, that was a lie. Libya, human rights atrocities, that was a lie. But in this particular case, you've got an actual genocide going on in full view of the world, and nobody is doing a darn thing about it. Yes, there are some sanctions against Israel. We're going to blockade Israel, but in the past, when there's been an egregious, an accused situation, a country is accused of a gross violation of human rights, the U.S. has just, or NATO has just gone in there unilaterally and taken that government out. In the case of Gaza, Israel is engaged in flagrant genocide, and nobody is willing to basically say, just as Nazi Germany and the Japanese, who committed massive war crimes, had to be occupied, and their government need to be held accountable, and war crimes trials held for the people who are responsible for this. None of that is happening. So that's the first time where we're seeing some completely unaccountable government committing genocide in the open. The next example is Iran, and many of you probably have not followed the situation in Iran, but I remember going back 20, 25 years, and even further, Iran has been accused of a nuclear weapons program by Israel, which is, extremely ironic given the fact that Israel definitely has a nuclear weapons program. It's had it for decades. Mordechai Vanunu, who was a technician at the facilities, exposed all that, and of course, when he was found out, he was put into solitary confinement for years. So here's Israel, who has had a nuclear weapons program in place for years, has been accusing Iran of having nuclear weapons, or on the verge of making nuclear weapons. But what's unique in this situation currently is that this is the first time that the U.S. has actually physically attacked Iran without congressional authorization, which means that it's violating U.S. laws. The President of the United States is not allowed to just unilaterally declare war or wage war without a congressional authorization. The Constitution is what authorizes that. But no matter, Donald Trump just goes in there and attacks Iran. So that's another first that's happened. Another example of this first-time situation is that for the first time we're seeing with this latest BRICS summit, we're hearing more and more discussion about the role of the U.S. dollar in the world financial system. And there's serious questions about whether the dollar will continue its dominance. Donald Trump has insisted on weaponizing the dollar against any country that doesn't go along with U.S. Hegemony, U.S. policies. And but the BRICS countries, there's basically 10 countries, which the original founders were Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then you have Indonesia, Iran, Egypt. Several other countries are now new BRICS members, and there's also BRICS partners. And they're talking about not using the U.S. dollar anymore, but using what they call cross-border payments in their own currencies. So this is another new development in how the economic system in the world works. And finally, the next issue is in Ukraine, because NATO has been, contrary to what it claims to be a defensive alliance, when in fact it was created in order to contain the Soviet Union. And I think the saying was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. And NATO has constantly expanded beyond the original members to incorporate former republics of the Soviet Union. And of course, they wanted to include Ukraine in that. There was in 2008, there was a resolution at an international conference saying, hey, we should let Ukraine become part of NATO, and we should let Georgia become part of NATO. Even Georgia isn't even really in Europe. So the war that is going on in Ukraine is a long-term project of the United States and NATO to physically weaken, undermine Russia in order to get control of its resources. This is the whole trajectory of Western civilization and hegemony and domination has been to get control of other countries' resources. That is what it's all about. And in the case of Afghanistan, NATO became part of that war as if is Afghanistan anywhere near the North Atlantic Ocean? NATO means the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What's it got to do with Afghanistan? And yet the NATO is involved in it. So you could say that's a first of its kind. But what makes this so significant in Ukraine is that here's this country which was not even a part of NATO. It's not legally not even part of NATO, and yet Western Europe gets it into its head that it has to defend Ukraine. Why? It's not even part of NATO. It's none of NATO's business. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire for centuries, and yet somehow NATO gets it into its head that it has to protect Ukraine in what was really a government that was installed by the United States in 2014. So after the coup, that coup government starts attacking the people in its own country, bombing them for 8 years, and arming itself to the teeth. And eventually, in 2022, when they're right on the verge of a major attack to finally take down the recalcitrant areas of Ukraine in the Donbass, Russia basically preempted that. They could see they simply would not allow another massacre of Russian-speaking ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So that was what started this whole war, but in its current iteration. But you don't hear any of that in the discourse. What you hear is that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked, as if what goes on in Ukraine is any of NATO's business or the United States' business. And then the second thing is that they say, oh, and Russia is losing, and they're completely wrong on both counts. So what makes this situation so unique is that the West really stuck its neck out here in order to take down Russia. That is really the plan, and so the fact that Russia has conclusively proven that no, NATO is responsible for this war. The U.S. is responsible for this war. They started it going back with the creation of Ukrainian nationalism and extremism and terrorism back at the end of World War II, and they nurtured these people all the way through the time of the Soviet Union. They finally got control of the country. They attacked their own people with the intent of bringing Russia in, and they thought that they could bring Russia down with the combination of sanctions and the collective might of NATO, and they failed miserably. So this is a real first where NATO has experienced a really serious setback. No, they haven't completely given in at this point because you have Germany who says that for the first, again, speaking of firsts, for the first time since World War II, Germany wants to attack Russia. Here's this country that its economy got hollowed out because they allowed a pipeline with cheap Russian gas that was subsidizing the German economy basically with very affordable energy, And they say, no, we don't want that energy anymore, but we still hate you anyway. We're not going to accept your gas, except through third parties where we have to pay more for it. This completely irrational policy. And yet Germany is talking about attacking Russia for the first time since World War II. There's even during the worst times of the Cold War, there was no talk of an invasion of Russia or an attack on Russia or the Soviet Union. So this is as I say, this is a first-time event. So why I'm bringing all these up is that we are in uncharted territory where a number of these first-time events are occurring in a way which is grossly destabilizing to the world situation. And it concerns me considerably because it appears to me that even though these cases, and particularly the case of the Europeans, are it's not. It looks like a first, in terms of Germany wanting to attack Russia, or the intention of the EU and NATO to take down Russia. But what I see, there is actually a precedent for that going back to World War I, where you had this really warlike mentality in the European countries, where they're just looking for trouble, and they're going to find it. But the problem is that unlike World War I, where they were willing to allow for 20 million people in Europe to die on the battlefield, or in World War II, where they're willing to allow 50 million people to die or more in Europe, now they have nuclear weapons. So they're really playing with fire now, and that is the big concern. We have these new precedents that are being set for going over red lines, and but the underlying psychological background of these people is what fuels these things. There's this combative mentality that just doesn't want to get along with anybody. There's this domination, even within the U.S. political class. They're fighting with each other for control, and yet the policy of them both, even though they're fighting with each other over control, is the same external foreign policy, which is domination. So you do not have any kind of viable peace movement or any kind of rational or sane policy being brought to the table. So that's where we're at. It's a very, very volatile situation, very dangerous. Where, as I say, we're in unprecedented waters, unprecedented situation, uncharted waters, and where it's all going is really, really uncertain. So that's basically the message for this video. If you think that I have brought some issues to your attention that are worth spreading, please do that. Please share what I'm saying with other people. And of course, if you're willing to support my work with either buying a T-shirt or making a contribution through Buy Me a Coffee or through PayPal, that's greatly appreciated. So thank you very much again for your attention, and I'll see you next time.